Well, welcome everyone to week 2 in Geography 4880. I apologize that these lectures are just a little bit late, but I'll say more about that in just a second. One of the reasons why it matters that these lectures are just a little late is that I am asking you this week to begin to make discussion board posts regarding the lectures indoor readings. That's because really we need to be engaging with the material in active ways in order to deepen our experience and learning in this course. Its success for everyone is going to depend on how well we engage with lectures, even when they're remotely delivered like this, as well as the assigned readings. So I am asking you as part of your mark, 10%, to reflect on this week's lectures, indoor reading, before the end of each Thursday, from January through to early March, okay, which is when we'll start the place-based workshops, okay? So there's 6 of the weeks that we have in front of us where I'll be asking you to make these posts, but I'm only we're only including the top 5 in your final grade, okay? So there's 6 opportunities, I'm only taking the top 5. And again, since these mini lectures are delivered to you a bit late this week, I'm going to ask you to make the discussion board post by the end of Thursday, not by the end of Thursday's class, but just anytime by the end of Thursday. So what you can do is actually watch these lectures Thursday and then take some time to write out your reflection. Okay. So the rubric for that assignment in terms of how things will be marked is available on CourseLink. So I encourage you to check that out. Now let's dive into the content for this week, okay? Week 2 is all about geography after 1930. Basically, we're talking about 1930, 40, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. We'll be looking at that time period in the history of the discipline, but we're not getting away from these big geographical questions. Okay, this is how your textbook summarizes them. What is the connection between the human and physical worlds? How can we account for spatial difference? It's this latter one that we'll really be digging into today because it was at the front and center of the discipline in the post-1930 period in geography. Now, remember from last week that Verenius, the 17th century geographer, named special geography as that geography that focuses on the unique qualities of areas. And that is really what human geography was about in the first half of the 20th century, 1900 through 1950 or so. Now, we also know that throughout geography's history, sort of general geography, systematic geography, as it's sometimes called, has been the other side of the coin. And we'll see that beginning in the 1950s, turn back towards that, focus on measurement and questions that can be answered anywhere. That turn, we'll see that expressed as spatial science, and it really describes human geography from 1950 through about 1970, and indeed to some extent on to today. So today, 1930s through 1970s, where we see a disciplinary niche carved out with space. Okay, geographers asserting themselves in different ways as a science. Okay, through the investigation of space. First off, regional geography, then a harsh turn away from regional geography towards spatial science, and in particular in economic and urban geography, and ultimately in what we'll come to know as the quantitative revolution. Okay, so that's going to be our focus today, looking at those things. We will get into a bit of the post-1970 period, preface that, foreshadow that later today, because it's going to set up a lot of our conversations in later weeks. All right. So we'll look at the critical and radical turn in geography that occurred with influence for the humanities in about the 1970s and onwards. We will be looking at key concepts today. We've already started to explore them. Obviously, we've seen concepts like place and space arise, but today's emphasis will really be on region and space. It's important to understand that many, if not all, the concepts we'll be engaging with over the coming weeks and that we'll ultimately employ in our place-based workshops, they are connected. It's hard to untangle how we define space without getting into other concepts like place, or as we'll see today, it's hard to understand region without getting into questions of landscape, okay, or place for that matter. We'll do our best. Please note that we will be unpacking and untangling concepts like landscape and place in future weeks. So we're not, leaving them by the wayside and ignoring them. We're just setting them aside for the moment when we get to them. Okay, so we're going to start here. We did see this last week. Environmental determinism, a theory about how the human world and the natural world, the physical world, relate. A theory that was popular in the first part of the 20th century and was expounded by geographers such as Ellen Churchill Semple. The idea was that physical surroundings were the, or perhaps a, major determinant of society, okay? This was really influenced by German geographers such as Ratzel. And the idea here was that, yes, physical environments present largely unsurpassable limits on human development. What kind of physical environment we have in a place, the topography, the climate, you name it, is going to set the stage and in fact structure and ultimately determine what kind of human development or what kind of advancement of civilization we see in that place. Another way of putting it, a simple way of putting it, is that man is the product, or humankind is the product of the Earth's surface, rather than the other way around, rather than humankind really shaping or determining the surface of the Earth. And as we also saw, this idea that places sort of inherently determined gave rise to specific societal structures and kinds of civilizations was really matched up with some key political and cultural attitudes of the time, such as colonialism. So why is it, that Africa seems so underdeveloped? Well, environmental determinism might say, well, it's a tropical climate, and that kind of, makes people lazy or prohibits development of certain kinds of infrastructure or whatever. That was the idea, okay? Note that that was a move away from blaming particular races, okay, for underdevelopment. It was a move away, it was trying to not be a racist theory, but nonetheless, it really did overlook some key factors and just simply blaming environmental conditions, okay? So for instance, it ignored the fact that colonial countries themselves often produced these kinds of underdeveloped situations, okay, through exploitation of resources, slavery, and so on and so forth, okay? So we saw that theory come to life in the early part of the 20th century. And by the 1930s or so, geographers were starting to push back on it. And this really led to the birth of regional geography, okay? An important key thinker in this was Carl Sauer, okay? An American geographer, most known for his stint at the University of California, Berkeley, and writing in a geographic sketch of early man in America from 1944. Carl Sauer really sort of started to push back on the idea of environmental determinism by instead flipping the coin, saying actually it is culture that determines the landscape we see around us, or at least greatly is more the contributing factor rather than environment shaping society. So he wrote, a given environment offers a determinable range of options to a given cultural group. This range for the same area might quite be different for another culture, okay? So in other words, it is, the environment still exists and is important. It offers ranges of options for development for cultural groups, but it is ultimately those groups and their way of thinking about the world that gives rise to different ways that they shape it, transform landscapes. Through cultural change then, those groups are able to overcome the physical limits of any given place, okay? So to transform the desert, for instance, into suburbia, okay, to take the example of the southwestern United States. So for Carl Sauer, then the human geographer asks himself or themselves why cultures arose in a particular place and why they spread over certain areas and possibly why they fail to maintain themselves. So this is really a kind of nugget at the heart of, as we'll see, regional geography. Why do we see particular cultures in particular places? How did they spread? Ultimately, then, in this way, culture and landscape were an iterative relation, not simply determining one another, okay, but shaping one another. And what this meant in terms of methods is that culture could be read through landscape analysis. You can go out into any landscape and look at cultural features or look at any features in the landscape and read culture off of them to understand who had been in this landscape over time. So just to take an example, this is actually from the US state of Wisconsin. And it is an example of reading the landscape. We'll get into more detail about that in actually a few weeks, week 4, I believe. The idea here, this is a wonderful book. It's, I believe, called Reading the Landscape or Reading the Wisconsin Landscape. And basically it presents these wonderfully done sketches of different elements that can be seen out in Wisconsin. Imagine if you were driving through the state and looking at everything around you. And these are the things you might see, okay? And so, it just takes these visual elements and does an analysis to look at, okay, well, this is Swiss architecture because it contains such and such elements, ways of building these houses. And, this means that this part of Wisconsin was settled or inhabited by immigrants from Switzerland. It does this for all different parts of the state, okay? And even has a section on so-called ethnic burns, okay? So we can tell the history of a place, or at least the settled history of a place, by looking at some of the visual pieces of its landscape and thinking about in terms of the cultures that had inhabited that and the different ways that they shaped that landscape through building different barns, growing crops in different ways, so on and so forth. So that was, in a sense, the earliest iteration of cultural geography, okay, which, as we'll come to know in just a second, is regional geography. And so one of the key questions for this kind of cultural geography was, well, what sort of regions can we categorize over time? And so one of the things that geographers were doing in the 1930s or so was, trying to understand, well, how is it that, places like Wisconsin, for instance, came to look like they did? Well, we can actually trace back some of those features in the landscape to so-called cultural hearths in places like New England on the east coast of the US, or indeed to Europe, where immigrants and settlers came from. And we can track the diffusion of certain cultural features across space. And we saw a lot of this work at this point in time, where we can look at patterns of settlement and architectural features and look at their diffusion through space. Okay, so this is building styles, different ways of making homes. And so we see, there's a particular pattern where in the upper Midwest in the US, strongly influenced by New England-based ways of building houses. You have mid-Atlantic influenced architecture, southern-based architecture, and these came to be known as folk housing areas or regions. Okay, so we see in the middle part of this diagram here, and this is where the notion of region comes into being. Okay, so the idea was that geographers could start to draw out regions on a map that were particular places that held very similar sorts of relationships with the environment, okay, and that were different from other regions, okay? So we start from this question of environmental determinism and how physical landscapes and the environment shape societies. We see a reaction against that from the folks like Sauer, who's emphasizing the role of culture. And we see ultimately this focus on culture shift towards or become interested in thinking, well, what kinds of particular places are there that share certain similarities, both in terms of cultural aspects, shared language, shared architectural styles, shared everything else you can think about culture, as well as relationships, shared kinds of relationships to the environment based on how they extract resources from it. So we will pick up here in our next mini lecture.